Well, go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 12 today. And we are in our home stretch when it comes to our study in Hebrews. I do want to say I'm grateful for good Christian fellowship. We had some folks over last night, so a couple of the young families of the church, and I'm hoping I'll stay awake all the rest of the day today. But it was a good time of food and fellowship and some game time. So just want to encourage you all. It was refreshing for me, and one of the things we talked about, a couple of us were talking about how that it's easy for us sometimes to run away from work. When that bell went off, we'd get out of work as quick as possible. Well, that shouldn't be the case when we have fellowship with believers. It should be hard to pry us away from fellowship with believers. That should be something that should define us, that we want to be together as believers. So I encourage you, invite some folks over in the next few months. I know it's cold. It's a good time to have people inside. You don't have to have a cookout or anything, but just have them over for coffee or dinner. It's refreshing, and it's encouraging to those. We've got several young families that we've gotten recently, and I want to make sure you're encouraging them and inviting them over. So complete separate lesson today. Go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 12. So we've been talking in Hebrews chapter 11 about what we call the Great Hall of Faith. And so we looked last time at that Hall of Faith, and I was talking to my dad after. I'll share one thing that I heard. There was someone in that list of faithful believers in the Old Testament that stood out to me that we read about. And she's actually mentioned in both, I'll say she is mentioned in two places, both in Hebrews and in a previous place in the New Testament about her faith. Who is that? Rahab. It's interesting when we think about Hebrews, who's this book written to? The Jewish people. And instead of just highlighting people of Jewish faith who were Jewish of faith, who was Rahab? She was a Gentile. She was from Jericho, right? But who did Rahab end up being a part of? Whose lineage did she end up being a part of? David, right? This was Ruth. This is Boaz's mom. So the idea that through God's providence, through His grace, that He took a Gentile and shows her faith. We call her the harlot, but she's really the Gentile. If you really want to call her out in that list of folks, she's the Gentile that showed faith, and that faith was universal, right? It wasn't just the Jewish faith that saved; it was faith in God. So that's just a side note. That was an interesting, as we were talking about it last week. That we often kind of just assume she's Jewish. We define her by her profession and not by her faith. It's a very, very interesting side note. But anyways, talking about Hebrews, so this first verse, it says, "Wherefore seeing we are also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." And that introduction, "we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses," has a direct, I think, interpretation where it's talking here, because he says, "Wherefore." And obviously when it says wherefore, it ties it back to what was in the previous chapter. And so he's talking about that hall of faith, that those are the ones who were compassed about by them, the great cloud of witnesses that are around us. So what do we learn from those witnesses? This is just a quick summary from last time. When it comes to our run, when it comes to our faith, that cloud of witnesses, they demonstrate God is trustworthy even in extreme circumstances. We looked at there's a champions list, or a summary of champions and a summary of challenges, and those that face some horrible challenges. And what did they demonstrate in that? It's worth it, regardless of the challenges, regardless of the perils that they faced. It was worth it. But we also see that that serving God is a privilege. It's something that not everybody gets to do, right? Not everybody. Only believers get to serve God, and without faith, it is what? Impossible to please Him. So again, it's a privilege to serve God. They show that there's both victory and struggle in serving. We'll look at some more of that today as we talk about the struggle that's there. They demonstrate the diversity of who's faithful. I mentioned Rahab, but there was men and women included in that, old and young. The variety of folks that are faithful to God. It's not just for the elders of the church or the elders of the Israel faith. It was for all to be faithful, and they showed different faith in different aspects. And we see that Christ assures us that joy comes from obedience. They were running for what? And we'll talk about that phrase in here in a minute. They were running for a prize, right? Their obedience to run their race led them to a prize, and that prize was Christ. Christ demonstrates the reward of submissive obedience, and we'll talk about that a little bit more today, about how of Christ's obedience and how that's an example for us in this race. And he shows us that the race is conquerable. He's our example. He's the author and finisher of our race. So let's give you a little history. And I'm going to probably butcher his names, but Phidippides. Do you might know who Phidippides was? 500 BC. You've probably heard about what he created, what he's known for. Phidippides was a Grecian Hermerodrone, and Hermerodrone, if you've heard, the god of Hermes. He was the messenger god in the Greek mythology. But that was the one. He was a messenger. Phidippides was a Greek messenger, and he's known for starting the first marathon. Everybody have heard of marathon? 26.2 miles. The Phidippides in legend became the first one to run the marathon. A marathon wasn't a race at the time; it was a place. And the legend goes that the Persians were coming to attack the Greeks, and well, I'll tell you the real story, and I'll add the legend in there. That the Persians were coming to attack the Greeks, and they were coming to Marathon to attack. And as soldiers, these guys weren't just just citizens hanging out, like to run all the time. These guys were trained to run. I mean, they were the messengers. They were your Pony Express in some ways. That they would run to deliver messages for the army, for the Grecian army. And he ran from Athens to Sparta, which is about 150 miles. Took him 2 days to do it. You're like, wait, 2 days? Yeah, 2 days to do it, to run from Athens to Sparta, 150 miles. These guys were serious runners. Again, they trained, they prepared for this. And his goal was to go ask the Spartans to come help the Athens, because they were city-states. They're two different they were friends, allies. Asked the Spartans to come help the Athens to go defeat the Persians. And the Spartans said, well, it's not a full moon, so we can't do it. So his 150 miles was for naught. Didn't matter. So he ran all the way back to Athens, 150 miles, 2 more days, and told them, the Spartans aren't coming, we're on our own. So then they went to the battle at Marathon, and that's where the Persians had come. And this is where most of the legend comes, is that when the Athenians, I think it was 6,000 strong, or they lost a few, like 2,000, and the Persians lost 6,000 or 7,000. And the Athenians defeated the Persians at Marathon, and he ran back to Athens. And as he got to the throne in Athens, he declared, joyous, we conquered, and died. So that's where we get the marathon from, running from Marathon to Athens. But this guy was a serious runner. When we think about runners today, we think, these people do it for their health. And they do. We don't have, in our military, I don't think we do, train folks to run, to go deliver messages anymore. And we've got cell phones and satellite phones and technology now to do that. And I'm sure our military is very thankful for that we don't have to have anybody trained to do that. But these guys, that's what they did. And so this is 500 BC. And what did this start for the Grecians? The marathon was the first game in what? The Olympics. So remember, Paul references the Olympics several times, or the games several times. He talks about beating the air. He talks about running a race. So this was the culture that was there in Greece. This spoke to, when he talked about running our race, this spoke to several of the Jewish Greeks, or the Jews that were living in Greece and in Rome. They understood what the games were. And so he's taking this cloud of witnesses, this great hall of faith, and he's going to apply it down so they can understand kind of how they should move forward. How do they overcome these challenges? And so I give you Phidippides because I think it's the expectation that he's really setting when he's talking about running the race. He's not talking like, okay, we're going to run a 5K, we're going to run around the block, and you're done. The Christian life, I wish it was a 5K, right? I wish we don't have to train a whole lot. You just got to go as fast as you can. You may be able even to walk, and you'll be good. But what's the Christian life like? What kind of race is it like? It's 150 miles in 2 days. It's a distance run. You got to pace yourself. You've got to train. You've got to be prepared. And that sets up that second part of that verse. He says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth easily beset us. There was a gentleman last week, I think it was week before last, just finished crossing the Antarctic on foot. Anybody thought about crossing, like that's a life goal that you wanted to cross the Antarctic on foot? He beat another guy, which I feel really bad for the second guy because he's not going to be known for anything, but he crossed most of the Antarctic on foot. And I was like, that's pretty bad. But they were interviewing him and they asked him, they said, well, what did you take with you? He says, well, I only took one pair of underwear, one pair of clothes. And they were like, wow. And he was like, why is that? They said, because every ounce counted, because I had to carry it. I think he lost 20 pounds crossing the Antarctic on foot. And he had these super power bars that were 3,000 calories or whatever it was to try and keep his energy up through that. So he says there, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us. What are some of the weights that can weigh us down in this run? What are some of the weights when we think about our Christian life? What are some of the weights that can weigh us down? Sin? Okay. So our own habits, when we put our own values before what God wants. Okay, what else?
Our daily struggles and trials that we face.
Okay, so they could be physical or financial, those things that we face that we get burdened and worrisome about. What else? What are some weights? Lack of prayer. Okay. So it's a burden for me. I'm going to carry a greater burden if I carry it myself, right, than if I give it to Christ. If I turn it over to God to carry. What are some other practical, realistic weights that we face? Attitude. Okay. So if we're not being changed into the likeness of Christ, those are some weights that'll carry us down. What others?
This would be part of general sin, but disobedience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just outright disobedience is a weight. I said and this is one that's been challenging me, and it's a conviction on me. God's still working through me on this one, but the one that continues to get to me right in my own life is materialism, and understanding that the American dream, our property rights that we understand as Americans and we hold so strong to, that's not what Christ calls us to. What does He call us to? His mission first, right? We need to be good stewards. We need to care for our own stuff, but it's not about getting stuff, right? Everything that I have should be used for the glory of God. And that's a challenge, because we have interest, right? We have hobbies. We have things we like to do. But God says what? Use it for Him. And that's a challenge. And that should convict us as believers that, I was talking about it was refreshing to have people over last night because that's, I've got a house, I've got a place, I can have a place of fellowship. So how am I using the stuff that I have to glorify God? If it's just for me to go in and sleep and eat and raise my kids, which is an important thing, that's not enough. God's called us to be so much more. We could have a whole study on hospitality and just what, that can be a weight. And then hospitality can be a weight. Because we can get burdened down with like a Martha, right? Martha and Mary be burdened down with the busyness of trying to prepare things to be that way. When really it's, God says just give of what you've got. Let me care about all the rest. So those are weights. And I think here when He says, and the sin that does so easily beset us, and I've heard this preached different ways, but I think in the context that He's given here, what's the sin that the Hebrews were facing when it came to their walk? What did they continue to turn back to? The law. The sin that was so easily besetting them was Judaism, right? As the Hebrews, they kept saying, you know what, we're going to run this race, but when it gets tough, we're just going to go back to our old practices because it's easier. Was that a wrong thing to follow the law? Should we follow the law when it comes to the Ten Commandments? We should follow those, right? As Christians, those are good rules. But should that define what our life is? Should that define our race? No. It was distracting them from their race. I think that, to me, he says the sin, and I've heard different pastors preach this differently, but I think in the context here, he says the sin which was so easily besetting the Hebrews was that they were turning back to the old ways, the things that had burdened them down. He says, and let us run with what? With patience, the race that is set before us. That's why I think of Phidippides and that 150 miles in 2 days. You had to be patient, right? You couldn't just start out with a sprint. We'll talk about that in a minute. He says, look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who is the joy that is set before Him, endured the cross, and is set down on the right hand of God. For consider him that endureth such contradiction of sinners against him, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Okay, so he's talking about the race, and he says there, who are we supposed to consider? He says, I want you to think of, when you're running your race, I want you to keep this in your mind, this person in your mind. Who is that? Christ. Keep Christ in your mind. Use him as your example. He says he's the author and finisher of our faith, who was, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down on the right hand of God. Again, we see what? He saw the finish line. He saw the joy that was before him. He saw what the enduring the cross would lead him to. He despised the shame, and then what? He conquered. He's sitting on the right hand of God. And why should we consider him? And in verse 3 it says it, for consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners. And he's talking about there, he says the world wanted to kill him, right? They said crucify him. That's the contradiction he's talking about, the contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Imagine this is Christ who came to save the world and stands before the people and says, in his heart he's thinking, I've come to save you. And what did they cry? Crucify him. Christ could have said, okay, never mind. I'm just going to leave. Change my mind. I'm done with this race. But what did he say? He pressed forward, right? He didn't faint in his mind. He was not weary in his mind. So I think about this because I had to share this just to put it in context. I understood this chapter a little bit better because I tried to do this. I'm not a runner. I'll say that. But I tried it a while ago, and here's the reason why. When you think of considering, that it came to mind my own application. I have a boss that I've worked with for the last 13 years. I've known him since I was in high school, but he's a triathlete. I mean, he's done Ironmans, he's done half Ironmans, all these. He goes around the world. He bikes in the Appalachians for 300 miles on a trip for 4 days or whatever it is. Some crazy. He's an athlete. I'm not. And for one boss's day, someone in our office had the bright idea, and he's the guy that had the idea is not an athlete either, but he had the idea, let's run a half marathon with Terry. And we were like, okay, yeah, we could do this. It's only a half marathon, right? 13.1 miles. We could do a half marathon, and it's a year away. We'll train for it. And we said, because he didn't really want stuff. Terry's not a stuff kind of boss, but he would like to see us working towards something, some team building. And so as we started to train, Terry was our example. And there was a couple people who asked Terry to be their trainer. If you want to learn how to run, you need to learn from somebody who knows how to run. Well, I'll tell you that for those that learned from Terry as trainer, that lasted about a month, because Terry's a tough trainer. And when you don't follow his regimen, he doesn't train you anymore. And I think about this as this example when he talks about looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Terry's run not 13.1 miles, he's run 50 miles and done a 2-mile swim and some other mileage of biking at the same time, and done a 10-mile race or 10-hour race. So I would not look to the guy that suggested it, that had never run a race before, to teach me how to run a race. Who should I be looking for? He's not the one that comes to mind when I start training, right? Who should come to mind? The one that knows that's done the training, that's completed every race that you can think of, that's run the Boston Marathon, New York Marathon, that travels around just for a weekend for fun to run 20 some miles or 50 some miles. Like that's who I'm going to follow, right? Interesting into the story. So we finished it, and the guy that suggested it ran about a mile, twisted his ankle, and got a ride to the end of the finish line. So that's lessons learned. But that got me and a couple others in the office to start to do that as for health and fun. And so we would run. And that last phrase there says, for consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. And it's interesting that he points this out here, because running the race isn't about necessarily the physical aspect of the race. That's important. If we're not serving, if we're not out there doing, if we're not out there witnessing and practicing the faith that we have, that's the physical aspect of the race that I see. But what can happen if we don't take care of the mental aspects of the race? We'll faint. Before I did the race on the left was 2009, I think, and that was 2011. The 2009 race, I would run about 2 miles a day, and then I'd do a long run like once every couple weeks, and that was my regimen, 2 miles at least every other day. And so I had practice. I was doing the work. But until you run 13 miles, you don't know the mental anguish that happens. This picture doesn't show it. I felt like my hands were about to touch that flag above me when I got to that finish line. But my hands were like right here. But because mentally in my head, I was done. You get to the last mile and your mind goes. You're thinking, I just want to get to the end. I just got to get to the end. And you just keep thinking that over and over. But and it's interesting when he says there, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. It's easy to get halfway through and be like, you know what? This isn't worth it. I want to live. Like there are people that died running a half mile before, and I just want to live. And it's easy to get distracted and say, you know what? There's a restaurant over there. I'm just going to go and have a seat and enjoy the restaurant and let everybody else run. But we've got to have our minds prepared, and we'll talk about a little more about how Christ or how God works to prepare our minds. But it takes practice. It takes us preparing both we can't just serve. We can't just show up and be present. But we also have to be preparing our minds to serve and to run that race. So there's rigor for discipline. So he says there in verse 4, ye have not resisted unto blood, striving against sin. And he's telling them, look, you're alive. You haven't shed your blood to run this race yet. You've been persecuted, but y'all are still running. You still got life in you. Striving against sin. And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto a child, unto children, my son. And this what he's talking there, reference is forgotten the exhortation. That exhortation actually comes from Proverbs chapter 3. He says, my son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? And I think often we read this passage and we read the word chastening. What do we think chastening deals with? Where does chastening happen? When are we chastened, do we believe? Most often. Disobedient. When we're disobedient, we get chastened. But keep in mind, this is the context of a race, right? How do you prepare for a race? You practice. And if you want to be really good at a race, who do you listen to? Who do you practice with? Terry. You practice with the guy who knows how to run, right? You practice with the coach. There was another guy I know that he knew that we were running the race, and he actually used to coach at Hampton University tracks team. And he found out we're running. He started giving me the list of things to make sure you're doing. And then when he talks about chastening here, he's not talking necessarily about disobedience, and I'll show you why in a minute. But he says there the idea that you're going to be harder, or you're going to chasten and encourage, you're going to push your son because you care about your son and you want to see your son succeed. But I'm not going to do that to my neighbor's kid, right? I may encourage them, but I'm not going to chasten them. I'm not going to challenge them the way I would my own son. Rachel and I were talking, and hopefully the kids don't listen to this video later on down the road, but we were talking about our own kids and kind of the goals that we want to see for our own kids, and how that we want to see them develop grit. You know what grit is? To be able to face a challenge and not just be like, I can't do it. Yeah, the idea that to be able to face the challenge and say, yeah, I can do that. Let me keep trying. And that comes from because it's parents, it's teachers, it's those around them encouraging them. But encouraging them like not to give up. And being hard on them sometimes. I think when you're practicing for an athletic event or basketball or any kind of other team you're on, what's the coach do? He makes you run. They call these things called suicides, and they call them that for a reason, because it feels like you're going to die, like you're going to kill yourself running these things. But you run from a baseline and then to another line and then back to that line. You have to touch the line every time, and you run every time. You go a little bit further until you're running the whole length of the court. And a coach doesn't do that because he wants to be nice to you. I mean, he doesn't. He's like, oh, just take your time, just run your suit. Take as long as you want to run those things. What does a coach do? What does a coach do? Are coaches known as quiet people? No, they push you, right? Most coaches when I think of a coach at practice, he's not quiet, or he's surrounded by people that aren't quiet. He may be the quiet coach, but he may have some trainers that are going to encourage people. Let's go. He's going to encourage you and push you on, and he's going to call you out when your form is bad, when your run is bad, when you're not pushing yourself. Because what does your coach see in you that you don't see? Imperfection and potential, right? So we see who God is. When we think of our growth in God, in Christ, what does God see in us? Imperfection. He knows our challenges, He knows our weaknesses, and He knows our potential. So we see this passage here. He says, it's not the idea that I should just go and spank my son or beat my son and chastise him, because he says that in here, that some will do that just out of pleasure, and that's of the world. But he says, what is God doing? God is chastening us. He's pushing us and encouraging us because He wants us to be able to run that race effectively and successfully. So let's continue on. He says there, skip down to verse 10. And he says there, for they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure. He's talking about the fathers. But He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. There's very few athletes who like practice. Who like, and I'm not talking about practice where, like, if you're a basketball player, you get to shoot around and kind of scrimmage. I'm talking about practice. Like, you just stand in one spot and you keep doing the same motion over and over and over again. Or you run back and forth just so you can get the practice in. Very few athletes enjoy that. You think of Michael Jordan. We'll talk about a lot of athletes today just because of the theme here. But Michael Jordan didn't make his basketball team the first time. He was too small. He wasn't fast enough. What did Michael Jordan do? He practiced. He practiced until he was able to get there. He's one of the few that want to do that practice. I mean, a lot of athletes, I think, understand the value of practice, and they know that it's going to get them to that higher goal, but it's not something people look forward to. What do they look forward to? Look forward to the game. Look forward to the race. Those are the things we value. But we don't value as people the practice that it gets, or the chastening that it gets there, that gets us there. But he says what? Christ doesn't do this to harm us, but He does it that we may be partakers of His holiness. That we it doesn't seem joyous, but that it may yield peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. So again, he's talking about this idea of practice. So let's look at verse 12. Sorry, I'm trying to think, make sure I didn't miss it. And we also see that in that passage, he talks about that Christ was chastened. And this is what I talk about. Chastening isn't just about, and I may miss it or it comes up, but I'll go ahead and hit it here. But he talks about Christ was chastened of God. Now, is chastening about disobedience only then? Because was Christ disobedient? No. But He faced trials, right? He faced challenges. He faced the cross, and so that's an aspect. We think of training and coaching. You know, coaches put you through some crazy things, and you're like, "Why am I doing this? Why are you making me hold my feet in the air? That doesn't make any sense. I'm a runner. I should have my feet on the ground, right?" But coaches do things to get us ready, and so when we think about our practice, sometimes we don't understand the chastening that God has given us, and that's what he's talking about here. He says sometimes we don't understand that the chastening is going to help us, right? That's really those struggles that He puts us through, that they're going to help us achieve. So what should be our response? So look at verse 12. Wherefore lift up the hands which hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight the paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. Follow peace with all men and holiness, which no man shall see the Lord. He says there, wherefore lift up the hands which hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight the paths of your feet. This race can wear you down, right? The race will wear you down. He says there, lifting up your hands, your knees, and make straight your feet. For a runner, when you get to a point, they call it a runner's high at some point. I've never hit that high, so I don't know who came up with that, but at some point you're supposed to be able to not even, in some ways, not even feel your body. I think you're out of breath or something is what that's called. But you don't even notice your body's there, you're just moving, It's a mental state at that point where your brain is going, and your body's going, and your brain's aware of it, but you're not having to think about your feet moving and your arms moving and everything else. And that's what he's talking about here. He's like, your training should be pushing you. So as a Christian, you don't even have to think about serving God. It becomes natural to you. Your feet, you don't have to, it's easy for us to kind of be like, oh, I got to come to church again. I got to go work in the nursery again. And kind of, our hands hang down, our knees don't really move like we want. We kind of drag our feet. I mean, that's what he's talking about here. He says, pick it up. He's coaching here. He said, pick up your knees. I mean, that's what a coach would tell you. Pick up your knees and run. He's like, push it. Go harder. He says, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way. What happens to the person that falls in the race? Sometimes they get picked. Sometimes they have to sit there a while, right? Because what else is everybody else doing? They're running a race, right? I got to win the race. So if you fall out, what's my first objective? To run the race, right? But what's he saying there? He says, lest what? Lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. He's talking, and we can look at other references to this passage, or to where he's connecting this here. But in other passages we see again and again, what are we supposed to do to the believer, to the brother that falls? Lift them up. Restore them again, provide healing, right? To encourage them, to lift them up, to get them back in the race. But he says, you know what? We're supposed to be lifting up our hands and our knees and making straight our feet so that we don't fall out. How do you do that? How do I, if I'm running, there's a couple of people I ran with in that race, and one of the guys ran in high school, and he wore sandals, wore sandals to the race. And you start in different segments, and so he was in a segment behind me just because you guess what time you'd run the race in, and they put the slower ones are in the back and the faster ones in the front. So he had done like 10 minutes slower than me, and anyways, he was right behind me. So I'm running, and next thing I know, here comes James, and he's passing me in his sandals, running along. By the end of the race, he finished the race before me, but by the end of the race, I'm finishing, and I survived. I can drive home from Virginia Beach, and I see him, and he's about to pass out. And I had to drive him home. It was so bad. So we think about this idea of race. What do we need to do when we're looking out for somebody? What should I have done for James, and spiritually speaking, beforehand? Do you really want to run in those? Do you really want to pace yourself like that? Because what's going to happen? Because sometimes as Christians, and I'm not saying we slow Christians down that are running ahead of us, but I think sometimes we're so focused on our own race. We don't take a time to notice the Christians around us in their race. How are you doing? You keeping up? Well, we stopped for a few minutes, and we didn't stop. We ran for a few minutes together and talked and say, how you doing? What's going on? Are you doing okay? Yeah, keep it up. And encourage each other. But as Christians, that should be how we define our race. Our race isn't an individual race. It's a collective race, right? We as believers are running this race together that's been defined by Christ. And we should be encouraging each other. We should be encouraging each other to lift each other up, to lift up those hands and knees and run. So then if someone falls, what should we be doing? Picking them up. And he says there in verse 14, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. And he's not talking about their salvation. He's talking about the reflection of God. You won't be able to see God in us if we're not running that race and caring for those around us in that race. So let's go on. So then he gives in verse 15, he says, looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God. So he gives here actually 3 different lests. So these are basically, he says, looking diligently, unless, and he gives 3 unless, 3 warnings that he gives if we're not looking diligently. When a runner runs a race, where should they be looking? Straight ahead, right? If they start looking around, taking in the scenery, and they can do a little bit of that, but if they start looking around, taking the scenery, what's liable to happen? What's that? They can fall, okay. What else? Get distracted. Remember, it's a mental race as much as it is a physical race. I can run, if I was in the gym, I could run from one end of the gym to the other with my eyes half closed, right? Because I can guesstimate how fast I can run and how far the gym is. But what happens if there's like 50 people in the gym? Right? I can run. I can fall. I can run into somebody. What happens if I'm running and if I'm running a race? Because we talk about this as use the 150-mile example. If I'm running a race and I start looking around and getting distracted, and what's a race? What's a runner focused on? their speed. They're focused on making the mechanics of it. Right leg, left leg, right leg, left leg. Like making sure that the mechanics are there. And if I get distracted and I start looking around, it's like, oh, that's a pretty bird. Oh, that's a nice flower over there. What am I going to forget? Right leg, left leg, right. And so the idea is I'm going to lose my pace. My pace is going to fall off. So he says there, looking diligently. Where are we looking? Where are we looking? Go back to the beginning of the chapter. Where are we supposed to be looking? To the author and finisher of our faith, Jesus Christ. He says, and we need to keep our eyes on Christ. He says, lest any man fail of the grace of God. And he's talking here, that word fail comes with the idea of falling down. That if you fail of the grace of God. And to me, it's this idea that unfortunately, this is the picture that came to mind. These guys are running a large hurdle race, and there's this giant hurdle in the way. And the guy's running, and somehow he doesn't jump before the hurdle shows up. Maybe he was distracted with the guys around him trying to run the race, but that's what comes to mind when he says there, fail the grace of God. I'm running, and I'm not paying attention to what's in front of me. And I'm not paying attention to the challenges that are ahead of me. And what's going to happen? I'm going to fall every time, right? Someone says in business, they were been with some business folks this week, and they were talking about opening up their businesses. And they were like, how much money do you make when you're closed? You're guaranteed to make no money. You may make, you may not have a lot of people coming in your store when you're open, but you're guaranteed to make no money when you're closed. And so the idea being that we've got to have our eye on that prize, our eye on Christ. We've got to continue to run, and we can't get distracted and just say, you know what, I'm done. It's not worth it. Or the idea that it's, I'm just going to sit here a while and take my time, and then I'll get up and start running again. For a marathon runner, what's the worst thing you can do? Stop. Once you stop, what happens? What happens physically? Your muscles are like, okay, we're done. You did 10 miles, we're done. No, your body has to keep going. So as a Christian, as a believer, as we're running, so that we don't fall of the grace of, or fail of the grace of God, this race that he's been given us, we've got to continue running. We can't stop. There's no stopping until we're called to heaven. The next lest he gives us, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Go ahead and turn to, and actually, the first passage looks back in Hebrews chapter 3, we talked about this, that we should be looking every day to make sure that someone doesn't fall in disbelief of God, of Christ. Hebrews chapter 3 talks about, we looked at that in one of the earlier lessons, that should be where we should be looking for each other in the race. We should be looking out for each other in the race so that someone doesn't fall of disbelief. I trusted Christ years ago, but I just don't see that joy at the end of this race. I don't see that. And that's what he was talking about in Hebrews chapter 3. Lest any root of bitterness spring up trouble you. Let's look at, go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 4. It says, let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Look at Deuteronomy 29:18 as well. Get there. Deuteronomy 29:18 says, lest there should any among you, man or woman or family or tribe, whose heart turneth away this day from the Lord our God, to go and serve gods of these nations, lest there should be any among you a root that beareth gall or wormwood. He's talking there that same root of bitterness. These are bitter things. He's talking about, lest any of us let that root of bitterness spring up. And what was he warning the Levites here, or the Jewish people here? That they don't turn to the other gods, that they don't get bitter against God. We've seen Christians get bitter against God. They face challenges again and again. And they feel like there's no way I can win this. There's no way I can get over this. That's what he's talking about, those roots of bitterness. I think of it as, sometimes we think of runners, we think of road races, and then there's these crazy guys that go over mountains and hills and in trails and all these things. And I just think of, imagine the roots of bitterness that we let spring up in front of us. Rachel and I did an Appalachian Trail anniversary hike. It was only supposed to be like 7 miles or something. It ended up being about 10. So that was the long story. But when you're in the Appalachian Trail, what do you got to look out for? Roots and snakes, which is a whole other story. But the roots you got to look out for, because as you're going along, if you're not paying attention to the roots, what's going to happen? You're going to fall. And that's the idea. He says, this idea that the roots spring up. Sometimes we let these roots spring up. It's like that root just jumped out in front of me. I was running this trail, and all of a sudden this root just jumped out. That's what he's talking about there. The idea that we let we take our eyes off the prize, off the trail, and we start looking around and saying, you know what, they got it really good over there. They're running on a road over there. I got this rough trail over here. What did David call it in Psalms? Again and again, we saw David say, look, the wicked prosper, and I struggle. And he was careful to let those roots of bitterness not spring up in front of him, so that he may fall. We also see, he says, lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. This is an interesting one. He says a profane person is Esau. And I thought about this, and I said, what's the race? What's the prize that we're seeking at the end of the race? At the end of the race, what is our prize? Eternal life with Lord Jesus, a crown of righteousness. What else? What's our prize at the end of the race? You accomplish something. We get to spend eternity with Christ, right? You can't beat that. Like, there's nothing greater than that. You get to be in the presence of God eternally. There's nothing better than that. And that's the idea that he's describing here. Lest any of us be like Esau and sell the great blessing that he had gotten just for a morsel of meat. And I was thinking that there's a race that's run, I think it got started in South Carolina, but they do this Krispy Kreme race. You run and you eat like a dozen Krispy Kremes and you run the rest of the race, which I don't understand. But imagine if we were running a race and we said, there's a Krispy Kreme over there. I could finish this race and get this nice medal, and get this great award, or I can just go and have me a Krispy Kreme. Like, that's what he's talking about here. Sometimes in the Christian life, we can be running a race and we can say, you know what, that looks better over there. Let me go try that for a while. We get distracted by the things of this world. I talk about laying aside the weights. He says that we don't want to become like Esau. We think of who Esau was, and in my studies, it was interesting just to we think of Esau as like this down and rejected man. Esau went on to live a very prosperous life. But what didn't he have? The blessing of God. We looked at it a while ago. The Hebrews were coming into the promised land, and what did God say? He was ready to let them go inside without him. He says, you can have the promised land. You can have all the blessings that you thought you wanted, of the things you wanted, but you won't have me. And then they repented and said, God, no, please come with us. And that's this idea that sometimes we value the things that we see around us, the things that we think are important, that aren't as important as we may believe. And so we've got to be careful that as we run this race, we don't get distracted by those things. Let me look at this last passage here, and we'll bring it home. It says in verse 18, for ye are not come into the mount that might be touched, that burned with fire, nor with blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, which voice when they heard entreated that the word should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure that which was commanded. And if so, as much as a beast touched the mountain, it should be stoned or thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was a sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. Where is he talking about? He's talking about a time and a place when Moses went somewhere. Where did he go? Moses went up to Mount Sinai, okay? Here's a picture of Mount Sinai. Tell me what kind of place that looks like. Desert place, right? It's not a welcoming place, is it? It's not a place you'd want to be like, hey, this is the promised land. Like, this is where I want to spend, I want to spend time with God here, because it's just flowing with milk and honey, right? No, he was there to receive the law. He was there to understand the mightiness of who God was. God wanted them to understand and revere him at this place. Look at verse 22, and we see this contrast. So there's Mount Sinai. Keep that in mind. He says, you're not at Mount Sinai. He's reminding them of where they're at in this race. He says, you're not at Mount Sinai where you saw my greatness. And even Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. He says in verse 22, but ye are come into Mount Sion and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to the God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better than that of Abel. He's talking about that Christ is it was the better sacrifice. Again, the old covenant and the new covenant. But he says there, where are you come unto? Mount Zion. Look at Mount Zion in Israel. What's the difference? It's green. I would much rather live here than here. And use that image in your mind of when he's talking to the Hebrews. They understood the difference in the places. One was desert, one was desolate. And you say, that's still desert to me. That's not green and lush. But to them, that was green and lush. And he's giving that reminder that you're not at Mount Sinai anymore with the terrible and fearful God. You're in the presence of God. Again, remember the tabernacle. Keep this in mind. The new tabernacle is what? Is where? Within us, right? He's dwelling in us. We are his temple. So the idea that we're dwelling with God, right? And that's better than what they had. But we need to keep in mind that who are we supposed to be revering? It's the same God. The same terrible God is the same one we get to dwell with. And he says there that he is God, the judge of all. And he talks about Christ, the mediator. It says in verse 25, see that you refuse not him that speaketh. And he ends his passage, he says, I want you to understand, you're not running just of yourself. You're not running of your own accord just to win the prize. He's like, you're running for me. You're running for the Most High God. You're running, think about it, when you run for somebody, there's a lot of groups that run. And I'm sorry, I'll be 2 minutes and I'll finish. When you run there's a lot of groups that run these races all the time. They'll have like Team Amanda or Team Josh. And they're running for people in honor of people who can't run. So maybe it's somebody with cancer, maybe it's somebody who's a military veteran that's fallen, and they say we're team so and so, and we're running for this person. Do you think that helps motivate people when they run, when they know who they're running for? Absolutely. It's harder for me to sit down and say I can't do it anymore when I know who I'm running for. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, see that you refuse not him that speaketh. Understand who God is and run for him. Follow him. He's not just waiting at the finish line for us. He's along the way cheering us on, coaching us on, encouraging us, pointing out our imperfections and seeing our potential and knowing that we can do faster, we can do better, we can do farther, and encouraging us in that way. And we need to revere him. I think of this, when you get to the finish line, there's all sorts of people that cheer. But as you're running and you're in that mental state of that finish line, there's always someone that stands out that you can hear. And you're like, they're cheering for me. I don't know who this person is and the thousands of people at this finish line, but that person's cheering for me. I'm going to keep running. I can make the last 50 feet. Even though I feel like I could just drop right now. But I know that person's cheering for me. And that's what he's saying there. See that you don't forget that Christ is one that's speaking to you at the finish line, calling us to the finish line again and again. And he says there, wherefore we receive a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace, whereby you may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. He's like, it's the idea that light a fire under you. Let God be the one that lights the fire, the one that is the holy and just God, that every step that we take should be for that holy and just God. Again, what's the race? If we run the race right, what do we achieve? We get to be partakers of his holiness. And he says there that he is a consuming fire. What's going to be consumed? Everything that's not holy. So as we run this race, we need to run this race so that we may be partakers of his holiness. We may achieve the race that he has set before us. So hopefully remember, this is the Hebrews now. They're facing persecution. They're facing trials. And so I sum it up in this. This is what he's encouraging them with. He's saying, look, I've given you a lot. Hopefully you understand the arc of the thread of the gospel through the Old Testament. Hopefully you've seen the witnesses that you're surrounded by that understood that and followed me to the death. And now I want you to run your race. I want you to finish your race strong without a doubt of who you're serving, without a doubt of who's coaching you. He's qualified, right? We have the best trainer in the world because he's already run it and he's survived. He's conquered it. So when we stumble and fall, you know what? He's going to be there to pick us up. He's going to be the one encouraging us. Oh, you can do it. Let's go. Let's go. Don't stop. Let's go. He's going to encourage us to make sure we have grit to make it to the end. And so that's what this passage is about. It's enduring to the end. So we'll get to this, when we get to chapter 13, he gives some final parting guidance about how we continue to make it to the end. Any last questions? Sorry, I made it 2.5 minutes, but I wanted to get through today. All right, let's close in a word of prayer.